Star Wars. It's one of the biggest, most famous franchises and a personal favorite of my own. A love that actually stemmed first from the expanded universe games, leading into me reading dozens of books and then falling in love with games like Star Wars Galaxies, an MMORPG set in the Star Wars universe, and Star Wars Battlefront, a shooter action game that felt like Star Wars' answer to Call of Duty or Battlefield. But before even those classic Star Wars games, there was a series of games made famous by highlighting the fan favorite spaceships featured throughout Star Wars and the combat and world surrounding them. The X-Wing, TIE Fighter, and X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter games led the way for what would become the most popular attempts at dogfighting-focused space shooter, or a space combat simulation as they used to be called back in the 1990s, becoming basically synonymous with the series. These games were about putting you, the gamer, in the power seat, or cockpit, piloting one of the powerful and wonderful series spaceships, such as naturally the X-Wing, the rebel choice of ship, or the TIE Fighter, famous for inflicting terror from the side of the Empire and recognized for the iconic sound. But despite how popular these games started off, their popularity, unlike gaming in the Star Wars universe, would quickly fade, with the last X-Wing game having dropped back in February 28th, 1999. And then, nothing for decades. Sure, now and then, Star Wars games would feature space combat and even some dogfighting scenes against other ships, but as an actual series and genre, it was effectively left abandoned by the same person who popularized it. That was until EA's Motive Studio would announce post-Star Wars Battlefront that they would be making just that, a space-focused combat simulator or dogfighter sim titled Star Wars Squadrons, which would drop in the fall of 2020. But despite some early successes, in a jiffy, Squadron's population and sales would peter out, unable to maintain enough players for a healthy matchmaking population even. Whereas as of 2026, it struggles to have more than just 100 players max. Well, detectives, this sounds like we have a mystery to solve, which is exactly what we love doing in general, I'll be honest, but specifically on the Death of a Game series, a series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to the death or process of dying for a game or company by utilizing a timeline of events filled with clues, developer and player testimonies, and most important of all, detective intuition. And so, the mystery begins, and the story of dogfighting space simulators starts to be told. Grab your hot-ass, HOTAS, or joystick detectives, and let's get to flying. The story begins with the founding of a new Canadian game developer studio, Motive Studio, or EA Motive, who would form back in July 13th, 2015, led by a former Ubisoft producer, Jade Raymond, in her hometown of Montreal. The purpose of the studio was to create new video game properties and IPs published by their parent studio, EA of course. Raymond and Motive Studios working alongside BioWare on Mass Effect Andromeda as well, who they would later merge with in 2017. They would assist DICE with development on the major sequel reboot, Star Wars Battlefront 2, which would drop globally in November of 2017. Motive Studios specifically was in charge of the single-player campaign of the game, something that's oftentimes praised, but as someone who bought the game at launch and played through it, it's one of the most forgettable stories I can't remember. It feels about as fast food Star Wars as you can get, with all the game locations just feeling like empty set pieces and NPCs like robots there to wait for the next scene. I expected far more from a mixture of Ubisoft and BioWare developers, to be frank, but it helped Motive Studio get some early experience, though they wouldn't need too much of that because despite being a new studio, they were quite experienced, featuring the likes of Ian Fraser, a longtime designer who was the lead designer on Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning and Mass Effect Andromeda. Talented level designer James Clement, who would lead his axe to Motive Studio as the lead gameplay designer on an unannounced upcoming Star Wars game. Senior producer Jean-Francis Boyer from Ubisoft, doing whatever producers do. A franchise director who has no prior gaming experience, but directed development on Mass Effect Andromeda and Squadrons. Anyway, which by the way makes up a lot of the team at Motive Studios following their merger, working on the next Star Wars project of course. Or the development director Charles Adcock, who worked on basically 4 straight failures. Motive Studio was a mixture of overrepresented on their resume developers, for sure, and talented developers, and people who had just come off working on a rather high-profile failure of a project in Andromeda. Now, this analysis might seem harsh or unnecessary, but I think it shows us exactly why Motive Studio had a pretty questionable track record regarding video game development, despite incredible opportunity I might add, as we will later explain in more detail. Before moving on from Battlefront 2 though, I should point out, the game does have some pretty serviceable space combat in the way of dogfighting, including being able to play with up to 24 other players and 40 AI bots in total. In Battlefront 2's Starfighter Assault, players could choose a ship and attack or defend a number of objectives, reinforced by up to 20 AI bots. The more battle points you gain, the more you can use them to spawn powerful hero ships. The maps varied over key locations on a planet to space battles taking over debris of the Death Star, and more. The space combat in Battlefront 2 is honestly not bad. It's mostly arcadey though and a fast-paced affair. But for dogfighting, that sort of combat works nicely in most cases when you're trying to appeal to a larger audience, especially when it's mostly a distraction or hobby for Star Wars Battlefront gamers who primarily engage in ground infantry or vehicle combat, on top of having a single-player storyline, of course. Despite all of this, Star Wars Battlefront 2 launched with so much pay-to-win that players found out at launch that it would take a massive 4,500 hours to max out on your unlockables in the game, or spend $2,100. 40 hours to unlock a single hero too. Battlefront 2 wasn't a bad game, but it was so full of monetization traps and lacking in core features it was rightfully hated by the fanbase. But enough about Battlefront 2, let's get back to the main victim of this case. Motive would finally announce another Star Wars game June 18th, 2020, following their work on Battlefront 2, letting their gameplay do the talking for the new game at EA Play Live in 2020. Squadrons was a space-focused dogfighting shooter that featured a single-player storyline, and the ability to team up with up to 4 other players, 5 in total, and online multiplayer. To be honest, the single-player offering showcase looked great at first. It had been ages since we've seen a new space game in Star Wars space, let alone one with a story attached to it that wasn't just replaying blowing up the Death Star. Dogfight mode was a 5v5 deathmatch mode, with the variety coming from the customization on your ship and your choice of abilities. But the signature mode in Squadrons was Fleet Battles, which effectively played a lot like a MOBA, where players must advance their objectives until they can defeat the final base, with the massive destroyers and frigates serving as like towers, so to say. Above all though, the trailer was very well and clearly presented, with a visual scheme that was both eye-catching, but not overwhelming at the same time. Hype was high concerning Squadrons, from the TIE Fighter vs. X-Wing crowd who were ancient at this point, but hell, even Star Wars Galaxies fans like me were excited as well, as the space combat expansion, Jump to Lightspeed, was one of the best eras of that game and one of the best iterations of space combat ever, where it would continue to be a fan favorite up until it got shut down. Though I did have my reservations about a game that was solely based on being a dogfight simulator, as it's such a small niche, even amongst flight-based games. IGN during their hands-on in the summer of 2020 would express quite positive thoughts concerning the new space shooter. After 4 hours of play, IGN would detail how fun the game was, looked, and sounded. The thing is, Squadrons seemed like the perfect sort of impression game. With only 2 game modes in multiplayer, no custom matchmaking, and a story mode that we didn't know that much about, I was very worried that the game would not have enough meat on the bones to last players long enough. The single-player preview would happen a few months later, just months before the game was set to launch in August of 2020. Players take control of both an Imperial and New Republic pilot, 2 characters locked in a fate against each other as the New Republic fights to create some new prototype ships before the Imperials destroy them, or the ships for good. Now, as much as we've talked about Squadrons being dogfight-centric, meaning battles between smaller, often single-piloted ships that focus more on maneuverability, a key of that genre is having a flight stick, as they would offer way greater movement and accuracy potential when flying a ship or plane. Motive Studios would announce support for this right before launch, which would likely ease most concerns for both the dogfight and flight simulator crowds. But there was a serious question as to what was Squadron's goal ultimately anyway. The game was set to be fully VR as well, though you couldn't use any motion controls or VR controllers with the game, only joysticks or standard controllers. And people will often quote the Star Wars X-Wing or TIE Fighter series or games as being a leading point of inspiration for Squadrons, but that's probably just nostalgia, because those titles were actual simulators, meant to try and be as authentic as you can be with a fictional spaceship. They are relatively realistic games, for example, allowing players to control energy management, target lock, and navigation through the in-game systems, which didn't seem to be the same energy or approach that Squadrons was offering, which you could see starting from the trailers but leading into the first impressions. All of this was streamlined, with pretty much only the energy management systems remaining. Squadrons feels like it was going for a more Call of Duty crowd than a flight simulator crowd, which was going to be a difficult bargain when such a genre barely exists in the first place and is arguably led by 2 gaming series that aren't even space or ship-focused first and foremost, Battlefield and, well, Battlefront. Would there be enough for a standard ball and gun gamer here to enjoy even with the rest of those games missing? Star Wars Squadrons, after roughly 3 years or less of development time, would drop on PS4, Xbox One, and PC October 2nd, 2020, globally. Squadrons would score a 79 out of 100 from 50 different critics, though a fairly lower 5.7 out of 10 from users on Metacritic. Squadrons would fare slightly better with the users on Steam scoring a 74% positive score at launch. Squadrons would score kind of all over the place, let's be honest. It was a great video game journalist game, as it offered a short enough plot story mode, 6 hours for the slow gamer and 4 for the turbo gamer, that they could beat, and have a super approachable drop-in multiplayer as well. These two things though wouldn't be enough to carry the game's sales alone, however, and instead ended up being massive leaking holes in the game. According to IGN, who made it a point to review the single player and multiplayer separately, would rate the multiplayer a 7 out of 10, stating that the thrill of using incredibly detailed TIE fighters and X-Wings to weave in and out of Star Wars Squadrons, mostly opportunity-filled maps as you duel other players in 5v5 dogfights, is an absolute treat. Right now, there are only 2 modes with 6 maps shared between them, alongside some simple progression to hold it all together, making my love for its flying more of a steamy affair than a committed, long-term relationship, which was a pretty fair and reasoned review, to be honest. For the single player, they would rate the game a point higher at 8 out of 10, where they would explain that Star Wars Squadrons single-player campaign tells an entertaining story, while its flight controls hit a sweet spot between accessibility and nuance, and it's made even better by VR and HOTAS support. Which, after reading the entire review, is a pretty glowing review considering they don't mention how short the game's campaign is. But this is where I kind of make a realization in my investigation that Squadrons was being rated on a separate scale, compared to many other games I've covered. It was being treated like it was a full VR game, a genre that has a much lower barrier because it performed quite well there. But not well enough when the game didn't even have full VR controller support, and at launch had issues with the game that locked the performance in FPS to just 60 and 30 FPS at times, which would cause motion sickness amongst VR players, in an already fast-paced and heavy sensation-blasting game, I might add. That's not counting for people that did have joysticks. They had to download other people's profiles or spend hours trying to tweak their settings, which made it feel like it wasn't very supported in Star Wars Squadrons. I feel like even if you want to rate Squadrons as a VR-only game, it still falls quite short of the reduced $40 price tag. 2 game modes in multiplayer and a single-player story shorter than TIE Fighter vs. X-Wings expansion. Balance of power just doesn't feel like it's worth the dough, especially when as soon as you are done with the story, you just have a surface-level dogfighter shooter to contend with in the multiplayer, that even while fun, just lacks so much to it, whether from features, modes, and progression, but also things like how severe the lack of balance was in Squadrons, further fragmenting its design. Simply put, Squadrons, beside its VR dreams and conflicts, was more so conflicted in design in terms of what they were trying to offer, wasn't what they were advertising. Squadrons was, effectively, when stripped down, a competitive shooter in space. I mean, hell, fleet battles against players are always ranked, for example. Not only are competitive shooters already fairly niche, throw one in space, and it's an even more carved up piece of a pie. This would be fine if the game was actually designed that way, or perhaps, but it wasn't. It was designed with ships that don't belong in a traditional competitive dogfighter shooter, which doesn't even really exist, to be honest. I mean, besides War Thunder, maybe. For example, people complain about the balance on bombers, as they can make it through your side of the map and spawn camp you very effectively and just one-shot you. Problem being, that's exactly what a bomber might do in a situation like that, and why would they choose to dogfight a superior vessel and one that has way more maneuverability? Same applies to complaints about the A-Wing. Complaints as old as since we were complaining about it in Star Wars Galaxies. It was a super small ship that's very effective at fighting and not being hit. But guess what? That was the point of it. See, the difficulty in trying to adapt something to a competitive shooter while still maintaining the essence of what that series or IP was about in a roleplay sense was difficult. Competition wants equalization, and people with the same tools. The variety in ship and their role across the Star Wars franchise made a dogfighter difficult, if not impossible to actually balance competitively. Squadrons was caught between being eye candy and classic Star Wars in ways, and then a competitive shooter. An unlikely mixture that, despite being able to sell 1.1 million copies, they would barely manage to double that half a decade later, despite going on multiple sales, sometimes as low as just $2. Clearly showcasing the market for such a game, or at least this game, was almost non-existent. I personally think Squadrons was better off just trying to be a VR offering game. But my guess is that Motive Studio rightfully understood that had they done that, they would have had to try to make a more involved sort of game, or at least single player, but I don't think that that's what they wanted. No, I think Squadrons' biggest problems revealed even from the start were just overwhelming mediocrity, and the feeling this was just a stepping stone game for Motive Studio, perhaps repurposing some Battlefront 2 assets, who reportedly were working on an unannounced title at the time dubbed Gaia for a number of years, dominating the majority of the workforce at Motive Studio, well, up until they would move to work on the Dead Space remake. Gaia, though, would be rebooted following some cultural clashes at the studio. Gaia was set to be the first Motive Studio IP, as they had promised to craft for EA, their parent studio, but instead, they were relegated largely to being a spin-off game developer seemingly. If I seem dismissive of Squadrons, it's because Motive Studio was dismissive of it themselves, as they put their eggs in other baskets, and seemingly treated the game like a grab and dash, more than a proper multiplayer title to support. Hey detectives, if you're watching this video and not currently subscribed to the channel, make sure to do that. Also, if you're not a member of the channel, or a member of our Patreon, please consider supporting the channel further there. We can't and choose not to rely entirely on ad revenue, as it dictates the kind of content we have to make too much. Because of this, any and all support elsewhere is greatly appreciated, including things like super thanks and super chats. Without this kind of support and the sponsors we take on the channel, we simply wouldn't be able to further create content at our current scale as it stands. So your help is much appreciated, as it's keeping the lights on both in my house and at my operation here, nerdSlayer Studios. But that was a quick ad break. Back to the case, detectives. Squadrons would be updated a number of times in the month of October concerning its performance issues, EA account login issues, and even the capped frame rate issue that I mentioned. But no new content dropped or was even promised alongside a typical multiplayer content roadmap. That's because, according to creative director Ian Fraser, the team had no plans to add to the released product. Fraser would explain that we've tried to treat it in the kind of old school approach saying, you've paid the $40, this is the game and it's entirely self-contained. We're not planning to add more content. This is the game and we hope you understand the value proposition. According to Fraser, Squadrons was never meant to be a live service product that provides content over time. Thing is, how old school are we talking here? The original X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter game, back in 1997, had an expansion pack titled Balance of Power. It was essentially a full single-player campaign, by the way. Halo 2, which launched in 2004, had expansion content or DLCs, and, well, updates. When compared to other games similar to you, like the X-Series or War Thunder, they have also had constant updates throughout their post-game's launch. Sorry, but this feels like a cop-out, an excuse you drop post-launch when the reception wasn't good enough as you wanted it to be, so you can move your studio on to other projects. Like, I get it, but nobody was going to buy into your game after you admitted this, which is probably what led to the sales dropping off a cliff following the launch too. But cut the whole old-school approach bullshit, when even the oldest dogfighting shooter in your universe had expansion content. If you don't want to be expected to fix or expand a game, don't make it multiplayer in the 2020s or beyond. The population on Steam would start at 35,000 players peak, but only managed to hit 5,300 players on average. And even within just 1 month, those numbers would be reduced to just 1/4 of that. Now sure, that's not counting the console players, as this is just according to Steam charts. According to sources, and this is where being a fanboy or shill is so cringe, accounts differ concerning why Motive Studio did decide to add more content to their game, or, well, further launch updates. But according to my sources, the initial sales were high enough to warrant further interest, though the community thought it was because, well, they had a positive reception with the game and they were nice, for some reason. The updates weren't big, but they were still pretty needed, which might speak to why they happened more so in the first place, let's be honest. Update 2.0, for example, which dropped November 4th, 2020, would introduce a new forfeit system into the game, allowing players to choose to continue a game missing players or not, and not just be held hostage as it was prior. The new system even allowed for backfilling while in the briefing room, including for ranked play. But these very basic mechanics not launching with the game in the first place were so crucial that it's likely they weren't going to be able to do enough to bring the players back that were already burnt by not having it. But at least some post-launch support was happening, even if it was Motive Studio fixing their broken game. Update 3.0 would drop a few weeks later, November 25th, 2020. This update was the biggest yet, adding a new map in Foster Haven, which was just kind of a campaign prologue map repurposed, and then 4 new components in the boost extension kit allowing for instant boosting, new piercing torpedoes, ion rockets, and anti-material rocket turrets for attacking enemy capital ships. The bombers would find nerfs in the way of reduced maneuverability, and the A-Wing in the way of reduced shields and the inability to use most of the newer equipment. Now, according to the game's subreddit, this update is celebrated like the second coming of something for some reason. Which, sorry, I think is kind of sad. Because a guy who sold you a product told you not to have further expectations, cause, reasons? You listened? Hey, maybe you also really liked the Amazon Prime gaming themed helmets that the game released alongside it as well. This update was largely used as a staging ground for the next-gen console release of Squadrons, as the next-gen consoles were just launching at the time, though the PS5 didn't get a full version due to it allowing for backwards compatibility with the PS4. Instead, Squadrons would receive a Xbox Series X version only instead, which launched December 3rd, 2020. This new version introduced enhancements to the console versions, both of them, of the game, introducing a 4K 60fps quality mode, a 4K 120fps performance mode, though the PS5 only allowed for 1800p at 60fps, lacking a 120fps mode entirely. Now the thing about the launch is, well, not a whole lot. If you hear or see a product is launching from a video game studio, or corporation in this case, you can almost guarantee if it does well, you're going to hear about it, which is why we heard about initial sales with Squadrons and then didn't hear a peep about it whenever the next-gen console release happened, so we can just read the room ourselves. The 4.0 update was a major update led by introducing two new iconic starfighters in the B-Wing Bomber and the TIE Defender, which is classified as a fighter but is actually a hybrid vessel. Yes, I'm gonna, well, actually them here. Heavily featured throughout the Thrawn storyline in Star Wars 2, I might add. But the best part about the update by far was the introduction, finally, of a custom lobby system and the ability to customize it further. There was even a custom server browser to go alongside with it. The sad part about this update is it mostly fell to deaf ears, as the population of the game was barely at just under 4,000 players peak and 1,500 players concurrently. You can't retroactively try to appeal to your community, especially when most of them already left and you already told them to move on elsewhere because you weren't doing anything more with the game. And well, gamers in the 2020s are getting wiser to games dropping missing core features that games 20 years prior had too. Motive Studio would move on to the successful Dead Space remake, and then to help DICE with their maps in single-player and Battlefield 6 following Squadrons. Motive Studios' Gaia would be axed finally, like Ragtag before it, sometime in February of 2021. Cancelled by EA after 6 years of development, Motive Studios' goal of being a new IP creator had seemingly failed. 2 balance patches would drop in the spring of 2021, with patch notes shorter than the intro segment in this video, primarily working at balancing the newly introduced TIE Defender and B-Wing. The final update being the balance patch released May 6th, 2021. Many years would pass, and in 2026 at the time of this video, Squadrons has not only not received any new updates, its player base is currently at 68 players playing as of an hour ago, and 117 players peak. The timeline, though, has come to an end, detectives, and although the servers still remain up for Squadrons, we have horrible news to end this case. According to the most recent reviews on Star Wars Squadrons, the game has been rendered completely unplayable due to a launch issue with the EA account services. Some players who managed to get through were then forced to use 2-factor authorization for playing the game every single time, while many other were still unable to even access it altogether. So, while Squadrons remains playable, that's barely. Why did a nostalgia-aimed dogfighting shooter fail to make a lasting impression with the player base and massive Star Wars fanbase? Well, in case you were missing any of the clues along the way, EA and company had no idea how to make a space game in Star Wars, or a game that requires depth. Launch issues, locked FPS, and a forced EA login, abandoned by the developers. A multiplayer game with more so typical single-player support. A glorified virtual reality game. Motive Studio. Motive Studio has long moved on from Squadrons, going on to launch a rather successful remake of the original Dead Space, a series we thought long retired at Electronic Arts and one that we covered in our series Death of the Game, and then go on to assist in Battlefield 6, which despite its problems sold relatively well at over 20 million copies. Though, in case you were paying attention, the parts that they helped with the game were the multiplayer maps and the single player part of the game, the most hated parts of the game. But beside that, I think the best fate for a studio like Motive Studio is to continue on as an assistant studio, helping other major studios' visions come to real life or remaking old ones. But one bad mark isn't enough to doom their record and say they can't ever make new IPs, but the 2 more mediocre ones alongside a good one doesn't help matters much either. But hey, they will probably keep making so-so games for the lowest common denominator Star Wars fan who barely even plays games anyway. But besides Motive Studio and their mediocrity so far, which more so seems to be a vision and creativity issue, to be fair, we have to make a final comment on the state of Star Wars games focused on space combat. And well, that's it's bleak, boys, not gonna lie. Simply put, standing on our own legs, the genre I very much love and enjoy is quite niche, and difficult for a generalistic franchise like Star Wars to design a game for. Especially one lacking in a proper deep single-player experience though, and the rest of the game parts that other Star Wars games typically have on top of having space combat or space portions to them. I hate to say it, but unless VR just grows tremendously in the next couple of years, I don't think the dogfighting space genre is ever going to grow past being a niche genre, which I'm fine with. But as it stands, it struggles to have any competition there at all. Which is just really my final wish. If I had one wish, you know, Ray J or whatever. But anyway, until the next case, detectives.